Hi everyone. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about our proposed algorithm for non-parametric biologically plausible learning of nonlinear controllers. The problem that we are trying to solve here is to understand how the brain learns to execute proper movements. For example, one may look at a pendulum and try to learn the optimal input in order to take the pendulum from any initial point to a target point and keeping it there. In case the optimal controller is a linear function of the state variable, reference 1 has proposed a biologically plausible implementation of a learning rule based on policy gradient which satisfies local synaptic plasticity rules. So what about nonlinear systems? A lot of problems in neuroscience are nonlinear, meaning that the optimal controller is usually a nonlinear function of the state variable. So how could we solve the problem in that case? Motivated by observations showing that distinct subsets of hippocampus cells are responsible for place and reward encoding, one can use a kernel representation of the space to linearize the dynamics, and this would allow us to find an optimal controller efficiently using the same approach which was proposed for the linear systems. So specifically, we are interested in using radial basis functions to represent the kernel space because of the fact that they are representable with the place cells, and upon selecting a rich enough kernel space, we would be able to represent a nonlinear smooth function as a linear function in the kernel space. So in order to solve this problem efficiently, we would also need to find the parameters of the kernel space. So specifically here, for example, for each radial basis function, let's say we have a location by referred to as mu, and we have a width which is referred to by sigma, and then we need to learn the weight of each radial basis function, the location, and the width of it at the same time. In order to learn the parameters of the controller, we use a multi-agent reinforcement learning framework in which we use policy gradient on both the kernel space and a linearized controller, and we show that it is possible to simultaneously learn the representation, the kernel representation, as well as the control matrix in the nonlinear dynamical system. So specifically, we have a framework with 3 different agents: one for learning the width, one for learning the location, and one for learning the weight of each RBF radial basis function. So as an example, we look at a dynamic system which represents the location of a person who's allowed to move in the interval -4 and 4. The dynamic is evolving based on the equations that are represented here, and the loss function is a summation of the absolute value of the location and a quadratic function of the input. So the space, the kernel space, is also represented using 6 RBFs, radial basis functions. To find the optimal input, we use 3 different learning paradigms. First, we use the fixed kernel space, and we only learn the weights of the RBFs. Second, we fix the widths, and we learn the weights and the locations at the same time. And finally, we learn the weights, locations, and the widths of the RBFs at the same time. In order to quantify the performance of each learning rule, we plotted the histogram of the average cost function for each of these learning paradigms. And you can see that for the case where we learn the weights, locations, and the widths at the same time, the average cost is significantly smaller compared to the other 2 cases where we use a fixed kernel space to represent the space. One realization of applying the learned controller for a test case is presented here. So we initialize the location of the system with some random point here, -1.6, and we looked at the evolution of cost, action, and state over time. And it can be observed that the learned controller can quickly take the state from the initial point -1.6 to 0, which is the target point. In conclusion, we proposed a biologically plausible non-parametric learning framework which is able to learn controllers for nonlinear dynamic systems with arbitrary loss